in the 12th chapter. Seems like we've been there quite a while, but we're getting close to the end of the chapter. Maybe we'll finish it up today. I doubt it. But anyhow, we're down to the section really that began at verse 18. We're through most of that, but I want to go ahead and read that entire section to get to the point of what we will be talking about this morning. So beginning at verse 18 of chapter 12, he says, "For you have not come to the mountain that may be touched and that burn with fire, and to blackness and darkness and tempest, and the sound of a trumpet, and the voice of words, so that those who heard it begged that the word should not be spoken to them any more. For they could not endure what was commanded. And if so much as a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned or thrust through with an arrow." And then the last part there that we'll be looking at today, verse 21, "And so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I am exceedingly afraid and trembling." And so as we began to look at this, talking about the time when the Jews came there to Mount Sinai, at which time God would give them the Ten Commandments, and the fact of how terrifying that was. They'd come to a mountain that could be touched, and yet we've noticed last week in reality they couldn't touch it, because for a person to touch that mountain meant death. And even if a beast, if an animal accidentally wanders away to that mountain and touches it, it's to be put to death, either stoned or, as the King James, the New King James says, to be thrust through with an arrow. Because this was a holy place. It's where God has come. And the presence of God made it holy, and therefore it was to be recognized by the people. They weren't to touch it. They weren't to come near to touch that, lest they also be put to death. And even Moses himself, Moses is the one that God has called to come up on that mountain and to receive the Ten Commandments. And yet even Moses, the statement is made here that he said, "I am exceedingly afraid and trembling." So he was terrified by being there in the presence of God. Now, if you look to the Old Testament, to the accounts that are given of that in Exodus, you're not going to find where Moses says, "I am exceedingly terrified." But there are times when Moses is in the presence of God where it does talk about the great fear he had and of his trembling in the very presence of God. And so I wanted to look at a couple of those verses here. First of all is, that's the passage we're on. Evidently I didn't put that up here, and I was hoping I had. I had it marked as being on here. So listen, if you got your Bibles, just turn first of all to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 9 and verse 19. Deuteronomy 9:19. This is the time when Israel has come and Moses has gone up on the mountain, and he's been gone for 40 days, and the people are thinking, no telling what's happened to him now. And they come to Aaron and they tell Aaron, "Make us a god, a golden calf that we can worship." And so he takes their golden earrings and necklaces and so forth they have and fashions that golden calf for the people to worship. And the text tells us in Deuteronomy 9:19 that when Moses came down, he said, "I was afraid of the anger and hot displeasure with which the Lord was angry with you to destroy you." So on that occasion, it mentions the fact that Moses was afraid. So here's one of those times that he was terrified. And he's terrified because of the anger of God. God has become so angry with the nation of Israel that his thoughts are of destroying every one of them and beginning again just with Moses. And Moses says he was afraid at the hot displeasure of God that he saw. So in the presence of God he was. Another occasion, Acts chapter 7 and verse 32. Acts 7:30, this is when Stephen is defending himself before the Jewish people. And he goes into a history of the nation, telling all about how God has dealt with them through the years and the various things that have happened. And he gets to the time about Moses and mentions the fact when Moses came to the burning bush, And he says there in chapter 7 of Acts in verse 32, God said to Moses, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses trembled and dared not to look. In the presence of God, when he hears God speak, it tells us that he trembled at that. And so here are two occasions where in the presence of God, it does speak about him being terrified and about him trembling. And certainly that may have been the case here at Mount Sinai because of what's happening to them, that everybody else has been terrified of it. And so he is, even Moses himself. So that's the way it was when Israel came to Mount Sinai. Now what the writer of Hebrews is doing, he's drawing a contrast, as he's done throughout the book, of what the Jews had under that old law and what we have today as Christians, and showing the vast difference between the two and how much better it is for us who are Christians and what we have from God. So when that law was given and they came to Mount Sinai, it was a time of terror. And we'll talk more again about that later. But now he says to these Jews, he says, but you, these Jews who become Christians, you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. So these few verses we have here from verses 22 through 24, that contrast what we have today, and emphasize it again to the people he's writing to, these Jews who become Christians. He wants to emphasize the superiority of what you have today as opposed to what was had under that old law when you came to Mount Sinai. But now he says you have come to Mount Zion instead of Sinai. What is Mount Zion? Do you know what was important about that city? Initially,
it would be hill, wasn't it?
well, it's a mountain, yeah. But initially, it was a place that was ruled by the Jebusites. And we talked about this in one of our classes studying through the Old Testament. You know, these Jebusites ridiculed David and made fun of him. They said, we can put our blind and lame people on our wall to defend it. And that would be sufficient to keep David from being able to conquer it. And so they made fun of him. But David conquered this city there at Zion, where that place where the Jebusites ruled. And when he conquered it, he in essence made it his capital for the time being, that he would be there on that mountain. It was in the 7th year of his reign that David made that his place or his capital. But Zion was more than just that mountain. It extended to just more than just that little area. And eventually it's going to encompass the city of Jerusalem and everything else. In fact, Jerusalem itself will be referred to at times as Zion. So he says, you know, now we Christians, the writer of Hebrews says, we have come to Mount Zion. But it's more than just talking about being in that physical area. Because Mount Zion is also the place that David made kind of the religious capital. It was to Zion that he brought there the Ark of God. He says, but you have come to Mount Zion. I've got that underlined, come. Because the word that he uses there. Now, a person doesn't have to be knowledgeable of Greek or anything about this, and I'm certainly not a scholar in the Greek language, but the word that is used there, now listen to the word, proselythate. Does that sound like any English word you might be familiar with? Proselythate. Proselyte. Well, what is a proselyte? It's what? Okay, someone who's been converted, who's been brought into that. And so that's the word that he uses here. For you have come to Mount Zion. And many people believe, and I think it's probably true, what he's talking about is you were converted. You were changed. You left the Jewish religion to become a Christian, a follower of Christ. You were converted when you came to Mount Zion. Well, Mount Zion here is not just talking about a physical city or that hill, but it's talking about the place where God dwelt among his people. Like I said, David brought the Ark of the Covenant there because of that very fact, to represent that. Give you this verse, 2 Samuel 6 and verse 2, if you want to write that down in margin of your Bible in regard to this. But 2 Samuel 6:2 says, the Ark of God, which is called by the name, even the name of Jehovah of hosts, that sitteth above the cherubim. When David made Zion his capital and religious capital, when that ark is brought, it is brought up to Mount Zion. Later on, when the temple is built, it was built in Jerusalem, Zion. That's where God chose to dwell among his people. And so coming to Mount Zion is coming into the presence of God, coming to where God dwells among his people. Now, question, where does God dwell among his people today? In the church. And so Mount Zion, I think, has a reference here in this regard to the church. That's where these people have come to. One other passage I wanted to mention in regard to this, Psalm 78, and verses 68 through 71. The psalmist says, talking about God, he said, but chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loved. And he built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth, which he has established forever. He also chose David, his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds, from following the ewes that had young. He brought him to shepherd Jacob, his people, and Israel, his inheritance. And so God is the one who's chosen Mount Zion. He's chosen that as the place to build his sanctuary. And it was there that God would dwell among his people. And so that's where we Christians have come. And so he's reminding these Jews, you haven't come to Mount Zion, to Mount Sinai, like the Jews of old, but you've come to Mount Zion. But still, you're coming to the place where God dwells, to dwell among him. And he goes on, and as he describes it, to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. So you've come to the city of God, and the city of God is described, he's called the new or the heavenly Jerusalem. And so again and again, you'll see that in the New Testament. It talks about that. A couple of passages in regard to the heavenly Jerusalem. Revelation chapter 3 and verse 12. He who overcomes, God says, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go out no more. And I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and I will write on him my new name. So they've come now, he says, to this new city, this heavenly Jerusalem, the city of God. And where does it come from? It comes from heaven. Sometimes is referred to as the kingdom of heaven. To emphasize this is where it came from. This is not something created by man. This is coming from God. It came down from heaven. And so it's that city of my God, the new Jerusalem. Again, further passage, Revelation 21:2. John says, and I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. So the church is described as a bride. The church is the bride of who? The bride of Christ. One other passage here in Revelation, verse 9 of that same chapter. Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls filled with the seven last plagues came to me and talked with me, saying, come, I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife. The Lamb is Christ. It's been introduced here in the Revelation, the Lamb of God. And the bride of the Lamb, he says, that I'm going to show you. And what he shows them is this heavenly Jerusalem come down from heaven. And so the bride of Christ is what we're talking to. And so the writer of Hebrews said, listen, you haven't come to that Mount Sinai. You've come to Mount Zion, the heavenly city, the city of our God, the heavenly Jerusalem. And so it's not the physical now, it's the spiritual they've come to. And again, Ephesians chapter 5, 22 to 32, you could read through that. And Paul in that chapter is likening the church as the bride of Christ. He talks about, an individual man and his wife. And he says, I'm showing you a mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and his church. And so the church is the bride of Christ. That's that heavenly city coming down from Jerusalem. And so that's where they come to. You've come then to God's church. And he's going to say more about that again in just a minute. But he also says you've come to an innumerable company of angels. What is an angel? Messenger, that's the basic meaning of the word, the messengers of God. And there are several passages in regard to that. Matthew chapter 1 and verse 10, when we're talking about John the Baptist, and the statement is made, says, "This is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send my messenger before thy face, who shall prepare thy way before thee." So John the Baptist is called a messenger. And the word messenger in the Greek is the word angelon. It's the word normally translated as angel. So an angel is a messenger. And so we in the church, he says, you've come to an innumerable host of angels. To all of these who are messengers of God and who serve God. Someone turn to Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 14. We want to go back to notice a couple of things that he says in regard to angels. Who's got that passage and read it for us? Hebrews 1:14. Okay, he's talking about, the context shows he's talking about angels. And he says of these angels, are they not all ministering spirits who are sent forth to minister to those who inherit salvation? Boy, I'd love to know more about that, what all is involved in that. The Bible doesn't go explaining everything about this, but angels are actually in some way, they are ministering to those of us who are saved. That we have that promise from God here about. And then again, in Matthew chapter 18 and verse 10, it's pointed out they continually represent the children of God to the Father in heaven. Again, Matthew 18 and 10, Jesus said, "Take heed that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven." There's a warning given to Jesus. Don't despise one of these little ones. And little ones may not be talking about children, but talking about those who are children of God. And be careful, you don't despise these individuals. Why? Because he says their angels in heaven are always looking at the face of God. Again, I'd love to know more about that. That's one of the verses that many people talk about, that we have guardian angels. Because they're the ones, every one of us evidently have an angel. It's assigned to us. And they're in heaven, always beholding the face of God. Now, we've come, he says, to an innumerable host of angels. So what is the innumerable? What does that mean? Yeah, it's a lot. It can't be numbered. He doesn't give a specific number of angels, but he lets us know, listen, there is a huge number of them. And several times in the Bible this is talked about. Daniel chapter 7 and verse 10, Daniel mentions them. Deuteronomy 32 or 33 and verse 2 talks about thousands and thousands and 10,000s times 10,000. And you have that same figure being given in the book of Revelation chapter 5 and verse 11. What is 10,000 times 10,000? Well, yeah. There's the answer, a lot. Well, again, it's not meant to say this is a specific number, but boy, when you look at 10,000 times 10,000 and figure out how many that's going to be, I didn't multiply it out. I just thought somebody would know. But yeah, you're looking, I don't know if it's millions or billions, or somebody said trillions. How much? 10 billion. All right. So 10 billion. Well, that's not the total number, because we talked about you got thousands and thousands, and then you got 10,000 times 10,000. So, there's enough angels for every individual that's alive on earth. And right now we've got 7 billion alive here. But there are enough angels for everybody. And so coming to God, hey, maybe I've come in late. Maybe I'm not going to have one of those angels that's watching after me. No. You've come to an innumerable host of angels. There's enough for everybody to represent everyone. And not only that, but he says you've also come to the general assembly and church of the firstborn. Now, there's been a lot of speculation by people as what's being talked about here. I noticed several people believe that this is a reference itself to the angels that he's been talking about, the innumerable angels. You've come to the general assembly and church of the firstborn. There's a few problems with that. When you're talking about angels, he says here it's the general assembly and church of the firstborn. And when you talk about the firstborn, what does that emphasize? And think about that. We just got through talking about Esau, a vain person who, what did he do? He sold his birthright. Well, what's involved in the birthright? The blessings that come that you inherit. The firstborn, the oldest, he's the one that gets, the most of the blessings. With Esau and Jacob, we talked about it. The oldest would get 2/3, and the youngest 1/3. But not only that, but he also gets the leadership in the family. He becomes the head of the family for them. And so there are a lot of things that's important about this. Well, the firstborn emphasize that, but that doesn't really apply to angels. That applies to men, to those who are inheriting something. Plus also the fact that later on it goes on to say whose names are inscribed in heaven or enrolled in heaven. Well, you wouldn't need to say that about the angels, because we know they live in heaven. They're residents of heaven. But you would say that about people, and we'll notice in a minute the number of passages that do emphasize that those of us who are children of God, we do have our names enrolled in heaven. And we'll look at those verses in just a moment. And so Lightfoot notices about this term that it has to do with privilege and inheriting. And so would not apply to angels, but would apply to men. But what men are we talking about? To the general assembly and church of the firstborn. The general assembly. I believe, and this evidently is, several people that I've read or writing about this say the same thing. The general assembly is talking about those individuals who lived under the old law. To those people that were faithful to God, who lived for God, faithful in keeping His will under that old law. And they lived and died before Christ came and before the church was established. It includes some people in the New Testament, people like John the Baptist, who lived and died before the church was established, that he would be a part of this general assembly. And so it's including all those people who are obedient to God, whether you're talking about those under the Old Testament included about it, those in the New Testament, plus those who are Christians who become children of God. And they're there in that general assembly. But it's also called the church of the firstborn. Now, well, let me say one more thing about that word assembly. The word assembly is sometimes translated from the word ecclesia. And what is ecclesia? The called out, the church. Now, in fact, the word church there is the word ecclesia. But the word assembly is not ecclesia. It's something else. And like I said, the word ecclesia sometimes is used simply of that. I got behind here on this. All right, that may include the saved of the Old Testament, but it's also the church of the firstborn. Romans 8:29 says, "For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren." So the church of the firstborn. Who's the firstborn that Paul's talking about there in Romans 8:29? Jesus. And when I read this, before I really did any study on this, when I read that, I thought, okay, that's talking about the church of Christ. That's talking about the Lord's church. He's the firstborn. But then when I got to reading, I found a problem with that. The word firstborn is plural. And so literally here, what it's saying is the church of the firstborn ones. It's plural. Let me ask you a question. Are you born as a Christian? Yeah. If you're a Christian, you're born. You've gone through the new birth. You become a child. You become a child of God. So all of us together are the firstborn ones, and that's the word that he's using here. He's talking about the many, not just Jesus. So we've come to, he says, this general assembly, and to the firstborn ones that here, firstborn ones of Christ. So all of us, as the firstborn ones of being born into his kingdom, we belong to Christ. And so, again, the whole idea that's talked about here is the church itself. The church is the assembly of God. Is comprised today of those who lived and died under the Old Testament but were faithful to God, and they are saved as well as we are today. Now, he's going to say a little bit more about that here in a minute. We'll talk about it. But then he says we're also called to God, the judge of all. Now, there are some different renditions of this. I know the Revised Standard, I think the NIV and maybe the ESV render this a little bit different, and you might not notice the difference in it. Does anybody have one of those translations? An RSV, an ESV, or NIV? Huh? Oh, which verse there? That's verse 23, the latter part of that. To God, the judge of all. 12:23. Yeah, I know that's King James. It's going to have what I said. It's going to be to God, the judge of all. And that's which one? ESV. Well, that's surprised because it's usually right down the line with the RSV. Let me read what the RSV says in regard to this, and you have to listen closely to see the difference in it. And a lot of people think that it doesn't make any difference at all. But all right, here's what the RSV says. You've come to a judge who is God of all. Not to God, the judge of all, but you've come to a judge, the God of all. And Brother Lightfoot says that he believes that what the writer of Hebrews is doing, he wants to put emphasis on the fact that God is the God of all. He's the God of all angels. He's the God of all people, living and dead. He's not just the judge of all people. He wants to put the emphasis on the fact that he's the God of all. And so, it makes very little difference, but I just bring that out because there are other translations that say the same thing. Now, to say that he is a judge who is God of all does emphasize the fact that he's the God of all people, living and dead. But is God the God of the dead? Well, you remember what Jesus said about that? I think I put this up here. That's showing the difference there. Genesis 18:25. Well, I didn't put it up here. I'm going to come back to that in Judges just a minute. But in Matthew 22 and verse 32, I thought I'd put that up there, where Jesus talked about this. He said, have you not read where he said, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Now, when Jesus does that, he's emphasizing the fact, the Sadducees didn't believe in a resurrection. And they didn't believe that Abraham and Isaac and all these others who died, that they're still living. But Jesus said, listen, he's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he's not the God of the dead, but the living. So that's evidence that they are alive. And what Brother Lightfoot's talking about is, yes, they're alive spiritually, but they're dead physically. But even though those people who've died physically, God's still God over them. He's still in control over them. But he's also, the Bible says, he is the judge of all. And that's the passage I flipped up here a while ago, 1825, where Abraham is talking to God about his plans to destroy, Sodom and Gomorrah. And he's wanting to know, will you destroy the righteous along with the wicked? And as he does that, he says, far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you, shall the judge of all the earth do right. So here he's called the judge of all the earth. So he is judge of all the earth, but he is also God of all. He's the God of all men, living or dead. He's the God of all angels. And so it really doesn't matter which one of these you take. Maybe the writer was trying to emphasize primarily that he's God of all. But it's also emphasized in the Bible he is the judge of all. And that's important here. When you stop and think about this now, the judge of all. Under the old dispensation, the Jews came before God in terror. Now think again about all the things that he's already talked about. God came down upon that mountain in fire and smoke. The smoke caused the darkness of it. And that in itself is being terrified. You're in darkness. And yet there's also fire. You're there and you hear the sound of thunder. The voice of God speaking. You hear the sound of a trumpet that's growing louder and louder and louder. And so it's emphasized. Then it's emphasized again by it says, terror such that even Moses was terrified, because God has said, if anybody touches this mountain, he'll die. And if a beast touches the mountain, you're to kill that beast. You can't kill that beast like you normally would by slitting its throat, because if you touch that beast, then you're going to die, because it's touched the mountain. So you've got to kill it by stoning it, or by casting it through with a spear or an arrow, as some say. So, it was a time of terror for them. But it's not like that for those of us who are Christians. Coming before God for us should not be a thing of terror. And that's the thing that he's emphasized again and again here in the book of Hebrews. Earlier in the chapter, and I'd like for somebody, if they would, to turn and read this, because I don't think I've got it on the screen. Chapter 4 and verse 16. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 16. All right, Jim, please. Okay. No terror involved in that. You have to come before God's throne with boldness. Why? What kind of a throne is it? It's described as what? The throne of what? Of grace. We're under that grace of God. We don't need to be terrified to come before God. We're come to Mount Zion, not to that mountain that if you touched it, you're killed. But we're come to Mount Zion. We're come to before the throne of grace of God to have that. And we're come also, it says, under this New Testament, that's what I'm talking about, to the spirits of just men made perfect. Now again, here's where I believe we go back to those people who lived and died under the old law, that were children of God, that lived faithful to God. We've come to the spirits of just men made perfect. Those men of the Old Testament, they made the sacrifices that God told them to do, and God accounted them as being forgiven of their sins. But they weren't really forgiven, were they? Those sins were being remembered every year, and they had to make those same sacrifices again and again and again. But when Christ came, all of that changed. And that's when they were made just. Romans chapter 3, verses 23 to 25, and we've talked about this before, but again, to emphasize this, Paul says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, being justified freely by His grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God sent forth as a propitiation by His blood through faith to demonstrate His righteousness, because in His forbearance God had passed over the sins that were previously committed." God passed over their sins. He accounted those sins as if they were forgiven. But they weren't really forgiven until Christ died and His blood was shed. And that's, again, emphasized over and over again in the Hebrew letter. He talks about how that the blood of animals was not sufficient to wash away sins. But we haven't been cleansed by the bloods of animals. We've been cleansed by the blood of Christ, which is sufficient. And these people, when Christ died, those people who lived faithfully God under the old law, whose sins were constantly being remembered, finally those sins are washed away. They are taken away. And finally they are truly justified in the eyes of God. And not only justified, he says, but they're men who are made perfect. And that may mean more than just being made spiritually perfect, being forgiven. That's already been emphasized. And it could be just talking about that now they finally reached that destination that they've longed for. Under that old law, those patriarchs were looking for a city who had foundation, whose builder and maker was God. But they never lived to see it, because that was not going to be established till Christ came. But now finally they're made perfect. They're part of that kingdom. They have that relationship with God. They finally reached at that goal through which all of them were striving throughout their lives to have that. And we have come to the souls of just men, made spirit, but also, he says, we've come to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant. And over again, that's the thing that's being emphasized. Back in chapter 9 and verse 15, someone will read that for us. Hebrews 9 and verse 15. Christ is the mediator of that new covenant because he's given his life, his blood is shed so that we could have our sins forgiven. Even the transgressions under that first covenant are now forgiven by him. And so we are able to receive the eternal inheritance that God has for those who are his people. Under that old law, blood had to be sprinkled in order to ratify that covenant. God at that time has instructed Moses, and Moses takes the blood of the animal and he divides it into two different bowls. And he takes one of those and he sprinkles it, there on the people, but he also sprinkles it, the text says, Moses took half of the blood and put it in the basins, and half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of all the people, and they said, all that the Lord has said we will do and be obedient. And Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you according to all these words. So blood was used to inaugurate that new covenant, but it was the blood of animals. But Christ is the mediator of a new covenant and of a better covenant, because that covenant is ratified by the blood of Jesus. And that was emphasized there. Hebrews 10:22 says, let us all draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. And so, by the blood of Christ, we've been forgiven. I thought we had to 15 after. We don't. We have to 10 after. All right, we're going to have to stop there. begin at this point next week. But he's going to talk more about the blood of Christ and the value of that to those of us who are Christians and what it's able to do for us that the blood of animals could not do. So, Lord willing, we'll begin at that point next Sunday. Thank you very much. We have just about 18 minutes now before our second worship service.